from what I'm seeing, Xi is very unsettled by Putin's activities and behavior. Of course, China doesn't want to see Russia collapse and then to face off against the West alone. But nor does China want to see Russia stirring up discontent in places like the Balkans and Korea and others, because it depends on the world system and particularly on the trading system.
The news this evening that North Korean troops are already in the region around Ukraine's Russian combat zone. So is this Russia's position on the world stage strengthening? To discuss, I have an expert panel. Firstly, Gabriel Galvin, a reporter at Politico, who's in Tbilisi; Teresa Fallon, the director at the Centre for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies; and Christopher Steele, the former head of the Russia desk at MI6. And I'm going to start with the question of whether the West is getting weary and less committed towards Ukraine and his plan for victory failing to take off. And can I pose that to Christopher Steele? Good evening.
Good evening there. Yes, I think that's certainly the case. And in fact, at Biden's meeting with leaders of the West in Germany recently, the Ukrainian President Zelensky wasn't even invited. And so I think we're looking at fatigue. I think we're looking at divisions probably within Western alliance, particularly in terms of things like whether the Ukrainians are going to be invited to join NATO at some point, and also whether they're going to be allowed to use Western weapons to fire into Russia, where part of this battle is going on. Of course, we've seen today that North Korean troops are actually deployed within parts of Russia neighboring Ukraine. So the situation on the ground is changing quite radically and rapidly. And I think the fear is that everyone's eyes are on the US election. And this is a time when Putin and his allies can exploit for their own benefit.
Teresa Fallon, do you think that that we should, in the West, view Putin's expansion more broadly, that it isn't just about Ukraine, that he has designs on extending his tentacles right across the region?
Well, he's been quite busy. We see his interest in Bulgaria. The Bulgarian elections are coming up, Georgia, Moldova. Even in the US election, there's been a huge hue and outcry against Russian disinformation, saying that vice presidential candidate Tim Walz was a pedophile. And this got millions of views on X and other channels. So I think that they have been quite busy around the world to destabilize, and they have other agendas here as well. So if you talk to anyone from the Baltic states, they're deeply concerned that it's not just going to be Ukraine, that any of the Poland, whose defense spending has gone up to 4%, which is incredible. This whole region is deeply concerned about Russia's plans. And if we go back to the Munich Security Conference of 2007, where Putin made this big speech saying that he was going to do all these things, well, maybe we should take him seriously.
Gabriel Gavin, who is actually in Tbilisi, what is the situation like on the ground? Does anybody expect the opposition to win, or is it just seen as a slam dunk for the Georgian Dream Party?
Well, look, I think everybody here and overseas understands just how critical this election is for Georgia's future. For the past decade, Georgia had been seen as the kind of golden child among former Soviet republics, a country that was desperately trying to step out from underneath Russia's long shadow. And this election really is being positioned by the opposition as a choice between a European future, being part of an integrated Europe, or reverting back to Russia's self-declared sphere of influence. And I think that's something that massively plays on voters' minds. But I also think that what Georgian Dream, the populist party that's currently in government, is trying to do is say, well, actually, it's not about that. It's not about authoritarianism versus freedom. It's about whether you have money to pay your gas bill. It's about whether we have a confrontation with Russia. And so you have this kind of clash between, I was speaking to a Ukrainian colleague, our reporter in Kyiv just this week, and she said, there's a Ukrainian phrase that when there's a battle between the television and the fridge always wins. And what Russia's really desperately trying to do is tell people, look, we can provide for you, we can make sure that you have money in your bank account and cheap energy, and you don't need to worry about things like freedom or personal liberty or these kind of lofty ideals that if you live in a town or a village somewhere, it doesn't make a difference to you. And I think we really, as the West, don't often articulate our case for why that matters so much. And I think these elections, which begin tomorrow, will be such a key test of whether or not we're winning the argument, whether or not we can kind of make the case for freedom, liberty, prosperity inside, a united Europe.
It seems like, from what you're saying, Gabriel, the Dream Party, the Georgian Dream Party, of course, supportive of the Kremlin or closer links to the Kremlin, is basically looking to sort of appease Moscow.
Well, I think it's been the case for the last couple of years that Georgian Dream and the elite that run Georgian Dream have their own private interests in Russia. They're certainly kowtowing to Moscow's interests, and they've the series of laws that they've basically tried to introduce have been astonishingly close to Russia's playbook. You've got a foreign agent law that's going to brand Western-backed NGOs, human rights groups, media outlets as foreign agents. You've got a law that bans everything related to the LGBTQ plus community, that from being transgender, being able to change your gender legally, through to pride celebrations, all will be outlawed. And Georgian Dream is saying that if we win this election and we win it with a significant enough majority, we will ban the parliamentary opposition. So you're looking at, in the space of just a couple of years, a slide from a country that's an EU candidate state into, effectively being Belarus.
Teresa Fallon, could you just explain for our listeners, as Gabriel has set out there, what could possibly happen in Georgia if there is a landslide for the Georgian Dream Party? Why does it matter to the West that everything that Gabriel has set out doesn't happen?
Well, Georgia, Moldova, these countries that have really, everyone just thought it was set, that it was the end of history. There was nothing more to worry about, that these countries are safely ensconced in Western values and they're embracing all of that. And it's not turning out that way at all. I remember when Obama was in office and he declared that Russia was just a regional power. So we're seeing, the outbreak of alphabet soup of different organizations. So BRICS, CRINCS, BRINC. I mean, Russia is finding and magnifying their influence through other groups and organizations of disgruntled countries that are pushing back on the West. And they think that the West is actually, corrupt and evil. And this is the narrative that they're using. And we even saw with the recent BRICS summit that just concluded on the 24th, that they feel that they're shaping their narrative as a savior for the global South, that they are pushing back against the hegemony of the West, that NATO is evil. And I mean, it's a narrative that seems to resonate with other countries. So I think unless the West improves their narrative, as Gabriel was kind of putting out there, we really have to, it's not, I think the West became very complacent. They don't really say what they do. For example, even the EU, when they build all these projects in Central and Eastern Europe or other possible accession states, they're not allowed to give credit, or they don't advertise it because they were fearful that this would be seen as a type of EU propaganda. So all of the good that they've done, they can't really advertise. And I'll just give you another example of a bridge that was built in Croatia that the EU funded, but the Chinese got a part of the bid, and then they advertised that they built this whole bridge for Croatia and they got all the credit, and people know no better. So the EU, the West, they really haven't been able to kind of put forth a proper narrative. And we even heard Jaishankar at the BRICS saying, we are tired of you wagging your finger at us, telling us what to do and how to behave, that they see the West as a bunch of missionaries telling them how to behave. So I think the West really needs to get their act together in sight of this incredible push by Russia, but it's in combination with China. China benefits from this kind of destabilization. And so we've never seen such a vital security risk since 1945. So you have Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, all together working to undermine the values of the West and the institutions of the West. So I think we really need to wake up to this.
Christopher Steele, how perilous is the situation right now, especially given that we're, only days out potentially from Donald Trump winning the US presidency? Is this something that you see as, Trump entering the fray could add further instability? Where do you see it heading?
I think Russia has a vested interest in instability. I think one thing which I would slightly disagree with is that China is fully signed up to this. And it's very interesting that the Korean Peninsula is one of the areas where Russia and China have significant differences. Russia, as I said, has a vested interest in stirring up unrest throughout the world at the moment. China does not. And I think there are some differences between China and Russia which could be exploited and will play out. I also think that,
just on that, Christopher Steele, could you just explain that a little bit, where you think those differences between China and Russia?
Sure. I think China has a much greater stake in the international system, both the international economic system in particular and free trade, but also in the international legal system. And from what I'm seeing, Xi is very unsettled by Putin's activities and behavior. Of course, China doesn't want to see Russia collapse and then to face off against the West alone. But nor does China want to see Russia stirring up discontent in places like the Balkans and Korea and others, because it depends on the world system and particularly on the trading system. So I think that's one thing. The second thing I would say is that the presence of North Korean troops in Russia or Ukraine could actually be seen as a sign of weakness. Of course, it's very sinister and it's very serious that North Korea would get involved in a war on the European continent. But also Russia doesn't have the capabilities that meet its intent. And I certainly think it would take several years for Russia to regroup and rearm in order to pose a serious threat to the Baltic states or Poland. I think the intent's there, but they lack the capability. And finally on that, there are signs that the Russian economy is beginning to creak. Inflation is quite high, interest rates are going up. The male workforce has been denuded both by the war and by people leaving the country to avoid the draft. And I think Russia's economic problems are expected to worsen over the next year or so. So I think those are slight caveats, but I do agree with the general thrust that the West seems to have lost the agenda, particularly in persuading the global South of the benefits of our system, but also of the righteousness of the Ukrainian government in its fight for its sovereignty.